Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Focus on Liberia on Primetime Sunday. My name is Dennis Jai, and we're broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In today's edition of Focus on Liberia, we're going to be looking at key upcoming elections in Africa, elections that we need to pay close attention to, and those elections will be coming up later this year, 2002, as far as 2023. So those key upcoming elections are very critical that we need to keep an eye on them. And so I have with me a list of distinct personalities to discuss these. I have joining me is our West African correspondent, Mr. Edward Amara, who's joining us from Freetown, Sierra Leone. Amara, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jai, and I take this special opportunity to greet folk across the globe and to welcome them to this special program tonight.
Thank you. Also joining us is Mr. Mohammed Sharif. He's our FOL political analyst. And Mr. Sharif studied these things. He's a historian. He keeps close eye on events happening on the continent. Mr. Sharif, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Thank you, Dennis. Good to be here.
Great. Also, Dr. Abdoulaye Dukle, the former envoy to President Sully, will be joining us. He's having some technical issues at his end. As soon as those issues are resolved, he's going to be joining us so that we can discuss these upcoming elections. Comrade, let me start with you. The whole concept of elections in Africa, right? At the close of the in the 1960s, when Africa was being dominated by these colonial powers, when they were finally gone, we saw election has the way to go so as to institute our leaders. I know there were some challenges there, but elections have been the way that we want to elect our leaders, capping the Western or the model from the West, how we can elect our leaders through multi-party democracy. So in democracy in Africa is not new. It's been in existence for some time now. Tell my viewing audience about the importance of election and how Africa has come to be a participant in this way of electing, especially electing our leaders. I don't know. Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Well, Dennis, Africa has come a long way. I would say in many ways, Africa has come of age when you talk about elections. In the 1960s, the era of when you saw the evolution of independent states all across Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa. In the early days, those referendums, whether you're talking about Guinea or Ghana or different countries, Mali or whatever, those referendums followed by elections that were held were quickly followed by a one-party rule. So you have this sort of one-party dictatorship, if you will, and so in that way, multi-party institutions were never encouraged in early Africa. So you have, in many countries where, whether you were talking about a Congo that became Zaire, and now it's back to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you have, a one-party state. To begin, it didn't start that way, of course. There was an election, and of course, the colonialists never left. The imperialists never left. So those African leaders that emerged in independent Africa were, especially those who were critical of imperialism, were also the victims of their own activism. For instance, Patrice Lumumba, who was murdered, and up to this day, his murderers have not been held accountable. And so when Mobutu Sese Seko took over as a result of a CIA Western-backed coup d'etat, Mobutu instituted a one-party state. So the state was Mobutu was the state. The state was Mobutu. Mobutu was everything. So the party, he instituted a one-party state for over 30 years. You saw the same thing in Mali. There was a one-party state. The same thing in Guinea, and so many other countries, west, south, north, and all over the place. So now there was a wind of change in the early 90s to mid 90s. And that's what you're seeing now. That wind of change, what happened was African countries are moving towards this sort of multi-party system. So that's what you're seeing now. It wasn't always this way.
Thank you, Mr. Sharif. Amara, when you look on the continent right now, there are elections all over the place, including the ones that were just held, including, for example, Zambia. You know, there is, it's almost every year we having elections. Give me a little, a brief on the elections that have taken place so far this year and what the outcome has been.
Thank you very much. I think, as Mr. Sarif rightly stated, Africa has come a long way in learning itself into this multi-party demography or liberal democracy that we are now tasting. And most of these elections are strongly contested because incumbents are normally stayed themselves in power for quite a long time. We have seen lots happen in Malawi. The opposition leader won. We have seen what happened in Zambia. Edgar Lungu lost the election to an opposition leader, and they are all crying foul. And we are seeing other countries into west, south, east, and north where presidential term limit have definitely been tampered with. But some of the most important thing, we should take the one like just happened in Malawi, where you have Lazaro Chikara, who took over from Malawi. He won the election, and based on the turnout of the election, the Electoral Commissioner declared him the winner. Seriously contested. The incumbent by then had no option rather than to give in. And we saw Chikara he took over and he cried down that the economy has been seriously ravaged by his predecessor, and he's going to set up a government of national unity and ensure that he institutes certain state institutions that are definitely going to investigate his predecessor. Unfortunately, the man who is a preacher turned politician, we have seen him going across the globe, taking along his family members, and people are actually crying him down. And we also saw what happened in Zambia. The incumbent lost the election. Edgar Lungu lost the election to the opposition leader. And he actually initially said he's not going to agree upon the results that the National Electoral Commissioner released. But after negotiation, and they asked him that Zambia is at stake, where the copper belt is no longer producing the copper it used to produce, and COVID-19 are also at stake. And he has been the president at the forefront of affairs. If suddenly he lost the election and they want to create a kind of situation where the country definitely go into a chaotic situation, so international bodies and other people came, and he decided to let go and said he only wanted to prove a point that the Electoral Commissioner never conducted the election on a fair basis. He also let go. So some of these elections are actually proving up. We have seen other sudden change of government because of one incumbent deciding to stay in power for quite a long time. We take another example in Ivory Coast. Ivory Coast, we saw Alassane Ouattara winning the election based on a manipulated principle. And when he lost, when Koulibaly, who was the prime minister designated to take over his governance system, suddenly the man died. It turned as if Ivory Coast doesn't have any competent leader with the exception of Ouattara. He went ahead to declare a candidacy and he won the election. We also saw in Guinea, Alpha Conde won the election based on the manipulated, a fraudulent election of a referendum that he conducted, and that particular referendum gave him the power. He won the election, and we saw what happened. Doumbouya took over. You go down into Horn of Africa, where you see Ahmed Abia, who took over the realm of affairs. Recently, he just won an election because Ethiopia is a time of parliamentary system of government where voters go in to vote for the prime minister, and they have the 13 regions are being governed by governors, but all of them are subjected to the central government led by Abiy Ahmed, who has been a Nobel Prize winner when he won that Nobel, because he tried to institute peace between he and Eritrea. Eritrea and Ethiopia, we all know, they fought war in the early 2000s, but 12,000 people lost their life, and that has been actually a very bitter thing. So Abiy Ahmed managed to institute that particular peace, which Isaiah Kikwete, who is the president of Eritrea. Based on that, I think he was given an accolade, and he also be given a Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, the country now is definitely at war, because you have the Tigray region who are pushing for peace, and they said they want to be independent, but Ethiopia, the central government, doesn't want to give them. The Amhara region, the Oromo, all of them are fighting against the central government of Ethiopia. And they are even saying that the election that Abiy Ahmed won was fraudulently conducted, because they never approved it. Because if ever they have to have a prime minister into Ethiopia, then it should be like a consensus region election. Every region should participate. But unfortunately, since Tigrayan we are at war, they never participated into it. So they are not going to accept Abiy Ahmed as their prime minister, and they have to push for their independence, or they should push for secession. And that war has actually been going on. So when we watch at it, a lot of actually going on in Africa, which are actually not too good for the continent peace. And we are seeing other movements that are taking place, because the wave of democracy is definitely pushing all over, and generation who are not actually used to this one party tendency are moving away from this thing. And we are seeing liberalists, we are seeing activists and other organizations that are involved into campaigning against this mentality.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And now we're being joined by Dr. Abdoulaye Douklé. Dr. Duke is the former envoy to former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. Dr. Duke, welcome for the fourth time on Focus on Liberia.
Thank you. This new technology. Every day you guys inventing something new, and then we can't. Anyway, how are you doing? I'm sorry, everyone. Colleagues, Mohammed, Amara, good afternoon, good evening.
How you doing?
I hope you have a good weekend.
Good. Thank you. We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. This is Focus on Liberia, and we are discussing upcoming elections in Africa. Who are the contenders? What are the issues that they are running on? And what do we expect to come out? In fact, what makes these elections that we're talking about critical, that we need to take a look at them and see? And based on what we are having with elections all over the place, I was looking at the map on EISA, that website, and it's like, there's elections everywhere. So let me bring in Dr. Duke. Elections everywhere. We're going to go through a lot of these elections, like Libya and Gambia for this year, Angola, Kenya, Mali, and Sudan next year, Liberia, Nigeria next year. We're going to go through.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Duke is having some issues there with his phone. So before we get Dr. Duke in, Mr. Sharif, is this all this election? Is it good news for Africa?
I'm here.
All right, Dr. Duke, that's your question. We have elections all over the place. Good news, bad news, or what does it tell us?
I don't think you can say there's any bad news when people have the chance to go out and choose their leaders, to choose people who are supposed to lead them. The problem is what happened after the elections. And elections don't mean democracy. And elections don't mean rule of law. And somebody said the best elections don't always produce the best results. So there are a lot of issues to deal with the elections. So I hope we will talk about the many aspects of it, and then be able to have a clear idea of what is going on with African democracy. Why, when we think we're taking 2 steps forward, we jump 3 steps backward. And then we have to climb back slowly. But definitely, I think, there's something good about people going to elections. People knowing that they have the freedom to get up in the morning and go look at candidates and say, okay, this is the person I want to lead the country. I think that's a positive thing. But it's hard. What's happening to it?
you said something. Let's talk about democracy and election. By having elections, can we say, okay, we have democracy in Liberia? We use the word multi-party democracy.
Well, Africa always had elections. Even when we had how you call them, the founding fathers who were president for life, they had elections. They had elections every 3-4 years. They only won by 99%. That was the difference. The difference is now that we have people who are, people are able to come up and say, I want to run for president, and you don't get shot, you don't get sent to a camp. And that's the difference. But we always had elections.
Yeah.
And we always re-elected the same leader until they died.
In other words, that wasn't democracy.
No, that was not democracy. Democracy is the choice, the freedom of choice, the freedom of being able to choose your leader when how you want it, and the freedom to associate with who you want, and the freedom to speak up, to speak your mind and say, these are the issues that are concerning me, and I want to vote on those issues, and look for the person who supports those issues. So definitely, yes, democracy is coming. We're not there yet. I think the missing link is the education of the voters. Do they know really what they're voting for? What are the issues that we're voting on? These are all things that we don't, people say, yeah, development. Development is not an ideology. Development is not a social issue. What is development? So if you elect somebody on the basis of development and they say, yeah, you never told me what is development, you go back to ground zero.
Thank you. Mr. Sherry, you have one more thing to say before you thought you wanted to say something before we jump into these elections? Because like in North Africa, we have Tunisia. Oh, there's an H there that shouldn't be there. Libya, Tunisia, Sudan, South Sudan, all going to elections between now and 2023. In South Africa, another election. If we go to kind of central, we have Angola, Equatorial Guinea. We go to the east, we see Kenya. If we go to the west, we see Gambia, Mali, Nigeria, Liberia, all going to elections.
Yeah, so I want to agree with Dr. Dukley. He mentioned that election by itself is not does not mean the presence of democracy. We saw that in post-independence Africa, where I just talked about that in the opener, where even Mobutu had elections, but Mobutu was elected by not less than 98% of the popular vote. These were fraudulent elections. Let's get that clear. They were very fraudulent. The elections were held based on intimidation of the voters. In fact, there was no choice in these elections, and so that wasn't democracy. So even though it seems as if we've moved past that era, but not entirely so, because in places like Equatorial Guinea, for example, you have one family that has ruled that country since 1967. Obiang and his family have been in power since 1967. It was his uncle after independence, and his uncle was a madman. So he overthrew his uncle in 1979. His uncle went on trial and he was executed. So Obiang took over from his uncle, and Obiang has been in power. Theodore Obiang has been in power since 1979. This was when Jimmy Carter was president of the United States. This is when we still have William R. Tolbert Jr. as president of the Republic of Liberia. Sekou Touré was still president of the Republic of Guinea. And you can go on and on and on. You know where I'm going with this. So just because Obiang is having election now, I think Equatorial Guinea comes up in 2022, but there is no real democracy in Equatorial Guinea. You can go to Gabon, next door Gabon.
And Comrade, we'll go step by step on these countries. Just and your thought right there. We move to them one by one.
Exactly, and that's what I was saying. Just because, and I was agreeing with Dr. Dukley, just because we have elections in some of these countries does not mean the presence of democracy.
Mr. Edward Amara, West African correspondent. Let's look at this country. Let's start from the north, and regardless of the year, but from the north, we have Libya, Tunisia, Sudan, and South Sudan. South Sudan almost coming all the way down here. Tell me about this election. Let's start with Libya. What's going on there? Who are the contenders, and what the issues are? First, let's start
Thank
with
you.
who's contending. What's happening
I
there?
think Libya and Tunisia are in the north, South Sudan and Sudan should be in the east or the Horn of Africa geographically. Okay,
Right.
having said that, we watch at Libya. We all know Libya has been under a strong dictatorial government by the late Muammar Gaddafi since 1969 independent. Unfortunately, he has to go the wrong way in 2011. And since the downfall of the strong man who ruled Libya with an iron hand, and because of international pressure, the Arab uprising that started in Tunisia, unfortunately, he had to leave, and he left like somebody who never had any respect. And because that tells you that the tenets of democracy was definitely violated over there, and people were willing, liberal democracy was pushing across the globe. Unfortunately, he left. Now we see Libya is now engulfed into political crisis. Unfortunately, Libya as a society is no longer it's no longer organized, living in a state, a total state of turmoil. There is a state of political volatile. The central government in Libya doesn't have absolute control over the state itself. We are seeing like Khalifa Haftar, who is one of the dissidents in Libya, who has threatened on several occasions to take down Tripoli. And we have seen the international community being involved. We are seeing countries like especially like Turkey led by Erdogan, Recep Tayyip Erdogan have on several occasions involved into Libya activities. And we are even seeing Egypt being involved into Libya activities because of the activities of ISIL, and ISIL also threatening Egypt because they share international boundary. Then we watch at the contestants that are into this election. Since 2011 up to now, Libya has never managed to have a kind of government that may exert absolute control over the state, and we compare the citizens to obey and provide the domestic or the basic needs of the Libyans. Now we are seeing Khalifa Haftar, who is a dissident of Libya, who has threatened on numerous occasions. He has an army over 2,000 or 3,000, and the United States and the UN have declared him a wanted war criminal. And he has established himself and managed to control a maximum part of Libya. He's a contesting candidate. And we are also seeing Kai Said. Said was Gaddafi's son, one of his sons, and he's actually on the United Nations indictment list. He's one of the indictees because of war crimes that he allegedly committed into Libya, and some of the crimes that he assisted in further in perpetrating into Libya. He was some time ago arrested in Libya. Later on, he was released, and the candidate registration for candidacy were actually open in Libya the 14th, and they were to last for 21 days within this particular month. Now he registered, and according to the High National Electoral Commission, the way they call it over there, some petitions were actually being tabled against him, claiming that he's already an indictee, and the international community, especially the ICC, the International Court of Justice, want him to be indicted, or he's on the indictment list. So why should he contest? We said the man has not been charged. He has been charged, but he has not been proven guilty before a competent court of law. And the laws of Libya do not state that he shouldn't contest for the election. He can contest the election as long as he has fulfilled the criteria that are meant for registration. He's also another contesting candidate, and all of these things are sending wrong signal, because we all know what the Gaddafi family did and how Gaddafi led Libya throughout his regime. Unfortunately, his son is now also another contesting candidate. We're also seeing Faye al-Sarraj. He is the head of the interim government into Libya, and he actually is vowing to contest for the election, and he has been on the helm of affairs of Libya, negotiating with the United Nations, other international body. And because of him, Libya has managed to exert some control, apart from the area of Benghazi or also Tripoli. They have some control within the capital city. And we are also seeing Abdullah Saleh Issa, who is the head of the House of Representatives. or the parliament, as we normally call it in Sierra Leone. So it's another contestant. So we are seeing civilians, we are seeing warlord, we are seeing children of former dictator being involved into the election, and Libya is just in a total state of turmoil. So everybody is just afraid. We are going to see what may definitely happen on the 24th of November when the election is definitely going to be conducted.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Duke.
Yeah.
Libya, I mean, I don't know what to even think about. What is the future? What do you see for Libya as they go into election? Is it something that based on their past, their recent past, and where they are now? What are the issues, in fact, that they are talking about? And what do you see in your crystal ball when it comes to Libya?
I think the Libyan problem is like what happened in Liberia at some point. The warlords fought and nobody could win the war. So they said, let's go to elections. And then they sort of form a transitional government, and then disarmament, no disarmament. The Haftar guy has never been disarmed. Nobody has talked about disarmament in Libya. All these guns, they've been fighting for 10 years, killing each other, bombing cities. So you have armies sitting down in different parts of the country without anybody telling anyone, you know what, to have elections with so many guns in the country, and some of them are traveling into the Sahara, into West Africa. It's a problem, but nobody wants to deal with that. So I think Sheriff was talking about the influence of people on Libya. That's a thing that every one of these candidates that he talked about, either Saif Islam, Hakkar, or the speaker, everyone is supported by one of those big powers, either the US, France, the Qataris, and Saudi Arabia. Everybody got a hand in the election. So it's like saying, okay, let's go to this contest, and whoever wins will support or work with that person. But I think the real challenge would be between Saif al-Islam and Haftar, who is the biggest warlord. Saif, because there's some sort of nostalgia about Gaddafi days. People are saying we want to return back to those days. Although there are people saying also, no, he can't run because he was part of he was actually the one who said we create rivers of blood with his blood, rivers with the blood of all the rebels. But I think it will be between the two of them. And I think it's going to be a transitional government coming out of elections, not really a democratic government. I think we're looking at a transitional government that will come out of that, and then maybe just like, as we're going to talk about Gambia, there's a dictatorship, it falls, and then you have somebody who takes over the pieces and try to mend the country. And then from that on, you can jump forward. But whatever happens in Libya next is not going to be a democratic government. It's not going to be a populist government. It's going to be dictators or son of dictators.
Mr. Sherry, you're smiling. So these elections, and we clearly know that it will not resolve the issue, but we're going to have it anyway.
Yeah, so in the case of Libya, we know that Muammar Gaddafi ruled for over 40 years. He has such a tremendous influence on the Libyan society and beyond Libya. And so his fall from power had serious repercussions on the region. Certainly, we're seeing that now in Burkina Faso, Mali, and even parts of, I think, in northern Cote d'Ivoire. So you see what happens, and Niger as well. So you see what happens when, the regime fell. And so there was, a civil war. Edward Amar has talked about that extensively. There was this civil war, and this war has not completely ceased. Dr. Ducler mentioned that there are guns in the hands of warlords who are, tribal warlords who, control bits and pieces of Libyan territory. So it's on the basis of that they're going to election. This is never a recipe for peace. One of the main contenders is Khalifa Haftar. Khalifa Haftar was a renegade general who took on the UN-sponsored government in Tripoli. And Haftar was supported by Egypt. in other Gulf countries. I believe the Saudis were also supporting Haftar. In any event, Haftar has declared his candidacy. Saif al-Islam, the son of Muammar Gaddafi, has also declared his intention to run for president. The Gaddafi wing is really crowded because you have another Gaddafi loyalist, Bashar Saleh, who was the chief financier of the regime, the real money man of the regime, a trusted confidant of Muammar Gaddafi, who's also has declared his intention to run for president. The interim prime minister of the interim government, he's also contesting. So you have the Gaddafi wing. If there's anything, there's a lot of competition. So even though there's this nostalgia for the past, but there's much work to be done by them if they can form a coalition of sort. But they still have a lot of work to do. The country still have a lot of work to do. There has to be disarmament. The country has to come together. Certainly, they haven't come together. They haven't figured that out. So Libya has there's tremendous work to be done in Libya for sure.
And Amra, where else do we see these external forces acting on these local elections? Like you all said, in Libya, you have these powers. Each have their own candidate that they're supporting, and sometimes for selfish reason. Where else do we see that?
Thank you very much. I think Libya is situated in a kind of Libya is just engulfed within international powers because of its strategic location. It's a strategic location at the same time the activities that are undertaken into Libya. Because when you watch in the northern part of Africa, you see Libya. It's sometimes share border with places like Europe, and at the same time because it is very close to European countries. And we are seeing Egypt also, which is very close to the Middle East, share border with Libya. And we are seeing activities that undertaken. Now Turkey is showing interest into Libya under Erdogan, not because it actually want to pacify the situation, but I think Turkey is going into Libya for even selfish and unscrupulous interests. It could be for natural resources, and it has actually been accused. And you are watching like of America, they may definitely want to see that peace come into Libya because everything started with a lot of commotion, allegations, one or two things. Because America and especially the Gaddafi-led government, we are never actually in any peace and harmony. And they have actually accused Gaddafi of killing some American citizens or one or two things. So they supported the issue. And we also watch places like Russia. Russia also have an interest into Libya. And we are seeing, even when you watch at the UN, the Big Five, you may see, you see like the UK, or you take like England, you watch at France, and you watch at America, always they tend to side one way. And you watch at China and Russia, they come with those. Sometimes China remain to be a bit neutral because they are not more competing with America or the US on basis, whether they are competing on economic basis. And sometimes they will come in, they just window themselves into countries and they. So Libya is just situated in a situation in around the Middle East. Where you see America has an interest into it. You see, France also have they have very big interest into Libya. You are seeing Turkey.
Mr. Amara, do we see that same thing in Tunisia, Sudan, and South Sudan?
Well, of course, you see it in Tunisia. Because Tunisia want to break away with certain things that France has to do with them. And France actually is having an acrimonious relationship with Tunisia because of what Kais Saied is doing. He's one of the most controversial presidents that is now leading Tunisia. He came in as an innocent person. They said he's a lawyer by profession. He's politically innocent. When he took over, he accused the Tunisian government, especially most of those who have had position into the country, because of corrupt practices. And he's the only president who has suspended the judiciary arm of government. He also suspended the legislature and installed himself in power. And now he's ruling by decree. And for now, there is no functional legislative branch into Tunisia, and there is no also functional judicial branch into Tunisia. And the only house that we have leading now is the president. So he legislates, and also he interprets the law and punish the lawbreaker. And France now is actually accusing the president of being installing a kind of modern dictatorship into Tunisia, and they want to take him out of power. But Kais Saied has maintained maximum control, because it is just unfortunate for France. They have not been able to influence the Tunisians, because what they were actually intending to do, France and other world powers, especially like Great Britain, what they wanted to do was to influence the Tunisians to come out on the street to demonstrate against Kais Saied. But the natives or the Tunisians, who are actually native Tunisians, have actually suffered from the yoke of corrupt politicians into this country. And according to them, if Kais Saied is trying to stabilize the country and do away with any politician who has been found wanting, or those previous corrupt politicians that are going to be brought to book, then they are definitely not going to be influenced. So he's also on the kind of gunpowder situation, although he has managed to establish control by the situation. But with the like of France and America, Great Britain, absolute criticism into the country, it's just a matter of time. Because should we see people coming on the street to demonstrate, like what is happening into the Sudan, he may have little or no option, because power belongs to the people, and it's the people that will legitimize their government. So the only thing that is keeping Kais Saied into power is the failure of the Tunisian to come out aggressive in the street. But definitely he's having a serious acrimonious relationship with France, and France take Tunisia to be like a proxy, and Kais Saied now does not favor the leadership of Emmanuel Macron.
Thank you. Dr. Douglé, the Arab Spring began there in Tunisia. What influence can happenings in Tunisia have on the rest of the continent, especially North Africa?
It's always difficult to talk about the North African regimes, because we always talk about democracy. We always talk about sub-Saharan Africa, even when at the UN they say, oh, we want democracy, we want this and that. The Arab Spring was nobody's made, with Tunisians who started that thing by themselves. And I'm not sure, the Arab Spring went to also Egypt. And we saw what happened to Egypt. That after the coup, democratic elections, the military came back and took over. And most Arab countries are pseudo military governments. The government is so strong, the military is so strong that, unless you have something like what happened in Libya, you don't really change the conditions. Algeria, they overthrew Abdelaziz Bouteflika. What happened? The same army, took over through generals. They were code source now, but it's the same military system. Tunisia, as Sherif said, I think the guy is doing, I think Tunisians were fed up with the old sort of democratic governance that they had before, and they allow him to do what he wants to do. And they say countries deserve the leaders they have, and I think the Tunisians want to have this experiment. One man who comes in and breaks everything down, and then they probably will wake up one day and say, you know what, we didn't call for this. But definitely, in the long run, it's going to crumble. I don't think it's going to take him anywhere. And I think the democratic process in the Arab countries is totally different. They don't really care about it, and nobody really pushed them because they're supposed to be rich. But everybody talk about Black African and democracy.
Thank you. I know that there are too many countries for us to cover. So what I'm going to do is we're going to address key questions and use these countries as examples. For instance, the critical issues that they are, what we used to in the West, especially the US, is anytime there is election, there are some issues that come about that voters will care about, and that the contenders or the candidates will continue to pound on. Do we see that in Africa, or in these elections that we have earmarked to talk about, being in Libya, Sudan, South Sudan, South Africa, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, and then coming to us in West Africa, Gambia, Mali, Nigeria, Liberia. Mr. Sherif, are we seeing issues-driven elections in these areas?
You know, Dennis, all people, I believe, want the same things. You know, people want, serviceable government, and there are certain aspirations that if people will want to see. For instance, back in I believe it was in either the late 80s or the early 90s, the Algerian voters elected the Islamic Front, and that was the Islamic Front Party. The FIS won election, but it was not acceptable. That government was not acceptable to the United States and Western countries, and the FIS was deposed. We saw the same thing happen in Egypt when the Muslim Brotherhood clearly won election in Egypt. This was the first election because there had never been election. You go back to history, there have never been election ever since the pharaohs ruled Egypt. So, when the Muslim Brotherhood won the election, there was interference from the West. So the CIA and other Western uh, agencies worked in concert with the Egyptian military to overthrow Mohamed Morsi, who was the democratically elected president of Egypt. And so what you have now is a military regime imposed on the Egyptian people. And the General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi calls himself, he has conducted some elections and he proclaimed that he is democratically elected. So now Egypt is going to move on to election, have an election, and he's going to claim that that's democracy. So in the case of North Africa, you have, and all parts of Africa for that matter, you still have the interference from, Western countries, especially in North Africa. In North Africa, there's always this tendency of North Africa. You have these dictators in North Africa. In Morocco, you have a king, right? So I mean, that's an absolute monarchy. So the king has been there forever, and that's gonna be the same way. It looks like you have Egypt, where the military keeps interfering in politics, and it looks like that's going to be what it is forever. And so, yes, there are aspirations. People aspire to certain things. You mentioned Gambia. One of the most interesting places that perhaps that I've looked at, elections that are to be held now or next year or maybe 2023 is Gambia. Gambia is very, very interesting for some key reasons. It's interesting to me because in the Gambia is a real, right now Gambia is a democracy. The last election they had was a free and fair process. But what you're going to have in Gambia right now is you're going to have the mentor against the mentee, the benefactor against the beneficiary. The president, Adama Barrow, who many believe he's an accidental president, is going to go against Osinu Dabo, who actually who was unable to contest the last election because he was in jail. He was thrown in prison by Yahya Jammeh, and so while Mr. Dabo was in jail, the coalition, I believe it's called the UDP. I think that's Mr. Dabo's party. They formed a coalition with other parties. And so because he was incarcerated, he recommended Adama Barrow. So talk about being in the right place at the right time. Adama Barrow was a private security guard working in London. Around election, he happened to be in Gambia, and he had political aspirations. And so Adama Barrow was picked by the opposition coalition that should he win the presidency, that he was to govern for 3 years as a temporary placeholder, so that when Usinu Dabo eventually would take over from Adama Barrow. That was the agreement. But once he get into office, Adama Barrow then reneges on that promise or that agreement. And so he did not.
Is that surprising?
That's not surprising. Not only he reneged on that agreement, he's stayed there for 5 years. Now he's going to run for re-election. And finally, one of the things that you should look for, that we should look for, Dennis, is in the Gambia, there are issues around certain. Adama Barrow is now accused of favoring his own people. Adama Barrow is a Fulani, is from the Fula ethnic group. Osinin Dabo is a Mandinga or Mandingo from the Mandingo ethnic group of Gambia. The Mandingos constitute over 30% of the population. And so it will be interesting to see what that tribal dynamic is going to play in this election. Barrow, meanwhile, has formed a coalition with Yahya Jammeh. And so talk about a real surprise. He has formed a coalition now with Jammeh's party.
Yeah. And Jammeh didn't want to move until he was forced out.
Correct.
Now the guy who, the army had to come in, West African force have to come in to get this guy out. Now you are building this coalition with him. What's going on there?
He has built a coalition with Yahya Jammeh, and human rights groups and victims associations are all up in arms, and they are very critical of that decision by Adama Barrow.
Dr. Duke, there is this thing that because the way democracy, we talk about, Mr. Sherry mentioned Equatorial Guinea earlier. Since 1979 and since independence is just the one family, some people have the notion that, hey, maybe this Western democracy is not good for Africa because see how they're taking it. What is your view concerning democracy that some even call it a constitutional coup, that you can do something constitutionally, but you still perpetuating one person or one family in power? Is the Western style democracy, the way to go, or there's something else we should be looking at?
I don't know if we should call it a Western style democracy, because we are running Western style governments. So you can say we'll take the horse, but we'll not take the drinking water. So if we take the Western style of government now, we have to take the government, the style of government, the democracy. The democratic process. I think what the difference is, maybe, I was talking to somebody not long ago, say, maybe Africa needs to look at probably the parliamentarian system, that, you have votes, you have representative in the House, that give you the chance to form the government so you can continue being re-elected. So that would not be a coup d'etat. You don't need to change the constitution. Like now, last year, they were trying to put term limit on the ballot. They put term limit on the ballot in the Gambia, but it failed. So this will give Adama Barrow the chance to run again 10 times if he wants to, if that stays in the constitution. So I think the problem is, it's not about democracy. It's a rule of law. The state that work for everyone. Respect of constitution. What do people agree on? What makes the constitution so manipulable by our people is that the government is still too far from the people. People still don't know what the government is. They think it's something that is important, and they sit in the capital and run their lives. They still see it as a white man thing in many places. They don't look at our chiefs. We have chiefs. They have a house of chiefs in every country in Africa, but what do? They're not sitting there to interpret the laws of the country to the people. They're there to serve as cheerleaders to the president. So that's, and that's what democracy should start with our chiefs. To tell people, no law will pass in the country until the chiefs go to the village and tell people what the law means, and then so they can say, yes, we relate to this, or we don't like it. But we don't do that. We read everything in French and English, and then we go tell people, yeah, we're going to vote for John Brown, and then everybody say, yeah, we like John Brown. So if you don't know what the state means to you, you don't think you have a stake in it. Now, the urban youth are taking to the streets. Like in Sudan, they're forcing the Sudan military to step down. They force Mali to keep, to kick the, but that's urban thing. But the rest of the people in the country who are in the country, look at Liberia. When you leave Monrovia, Calcutta, you can get government radio station. After 170 years, you can get government radio station in Calcutta. How do you call that democracy? So it's not just about the effectiveness or ineffectiveness of the electoral process. It's our whole concept, our whole understanding of what is democracy, what is rule of law, what is the state, who does it belong to, how does it function? Our people don't understand it. So anybody can come and manipulate the process and take it over. And our small bourgeoisie, who's always looking for a job or money, goes along.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, you said something very, very critical, right? That what really is this democracy if we can't even eat, if we don't have light, if we don't have, if we, there's no government radio station in Calcutta. Don't talk about me all the way beyond God's holy back in Dodwicken, right? So what is this democracy? So expand a little bit on that.
No, but because democracy is first the power to the people. Power, our sheriff said the power to the people. People own the states. And we came from colonial rule, either from America, Liberia, we can say it was not a colony, but it was a colony. Maybe the intention was not to create a colony, but it became a colony. Because the black in Liberia were acting like the Frenchmen in Ivory Coast or Mali. And we came out of that. So the people always saw the states as an imported machinery to exploit them, make them work, pay them low wages, and take their natural resources. We became independent. What had changed? Nothing. Because the economy is still run the same way as it was run by the colonialists. Our priorities are still set by the World Bank, the IMF, or Paris, or New York. We don't get to say, this is going wrong in our country. When you take news, BBC News is more important in Liberia than LBC News.
Yeah.
And that's the case. So you are not independent. You live in a state of, you live in a limbo between what you call, self-determination, emancipation, and a zone where you don't really matter. That African citizens don't matter to the government. And just like the government is seen as an exploitative machine, because we have not been able to transform our social system, our economic system from the colonial system that was set up. And as long as you keep going onto that colonial system, you will have 99% of the people hungry and 1% of people eating well because they're dealing with external powers and few companies that put in money.
Let me go to Edward. Edward, I know we touched on few of these elections that we were talking about. I know we talk about Libya, Tunisia, and give some example. But of the rest, Sudan, Angola, Equatorial Guinea, Kenya, Gambia, Mali, Nigeria, Liberia. Give me a little summary of some of these key elections that we need to look at and why. Do we need to keep a close eye on these elections?
Let's start in the Horn of Africa. Watch at Kenya. Kenya is a very interesting country into the Horn of Africa. We know Kenya, since independence in 1963, you have had presidents like Jomo Kenyatta, Daniel Arap Moi. You have Daniel Arap Moi, Jomo Kenyatta, Uhuru Kenyatta, and others. Now, we are going to watch Kenya into a particular situation. In fact, Kenya, politics over there is strictly placed on tribal background. They have the Kikuyu, who are the largest tribe into Kenya, and 22% of the population. But they actually group themselves in three parts. You have the Bantu, that it comprises the Kikuyu. If you call the Bantu, including the other tribes, including the Kisis and others, they made up 67% of the total population into Kenya. And they have the Nilutu, where you have the Orala Odinka, who is the opposition leader led by the Orange, opposition party. They have 30%. Then they have the acoustic, who are just 3%. And it is just unfortunate that in Kenya, if you are not part of the Kikuyu who actually made up the Bantu population, you cannot win election. And Kenya's election is almost because when you watch at election, the election involved in 3 phases: the before, the after, and the during, before, and after. We are going to see a huge tribal confrontation into Kenya, and it may definitely result into a lot of things, because that's what normally happens into Kenya. And we also head into the South Sudan. South Sudan, it doesn't matter who wins the election. The fact is that somebody must be able to stop the political volatile situation over there. Unfortunately, the army into South Sudan, the national army, are very small compared to the foreign-based army into South Sudan. And you watch at Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, the president-elect and his vice president are definitely not at peace. And they normally fight the Dinkas and other people, they fight over there. So there is another tribal tension over there. And South Sudan is a very young country. It came into existence since 2011. They have never been at peace. They have fought war with Northern Sudan, and now they are into the acrimonious situation. So it's another key election that we need to watch, and that country is actually on the gunpowder. Let us see Angola. Angola have a peculiar way of voting for election. Unlike Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, or other countries where you go and vote for your president, you vote for the MP, and others over there, you're only going to vote for, they vote on the list system. And the list system that they do voting, you are going to vote for the president. And when you vote for the president, it means the president has the right now to appoint his MP and also appoint the member of cabinet. So you cannot, people within constituencies cannot elect somebody whom they think that they are going to represent. Rather, the president draw his own list and elect and select those. It may look like a parliamentary system, but it's a kind of proportional representation. And even the members of parliament are actually allocated based on the presidential vote that people are going to give to a particular candidate. Then finally, we watch at Equatorial Guinea. It's a very funny state. You watch at this man, Obiang has been in power since 1979 after he assassinated, or he overthrew his uncle and brought him to trial, and later on he was executed. He has his vice president as his son, and he has managed to manipulate the system, create a kind of position for the prime minister, which is more or less a kind of ceremonial position where the prime minister doesn't have any personal control. And this man, who is the people, has on numerous occasions have been accused of embezzlement, mismanagement, and most of his funds have been seized across. So this thing, finally, we go into West Africa, where you have Gambia. Gambia is a kind of situation that is too funny to watch at, because Yahya Jammeh was driven. Now Yahya Jammeh may definitely come in as crown king, because should Adama Barrow win, Yahya Jammeh is definitely going to come, because he's not the only person that is going to win the election. And you cannot blame Adama Barrow now, because the coalition that brought him to power, he has sacked that coalition and formed his own political party. Now he has no option to form a party. If you watch now at Nigeria, Buhari is definitely going, because that is his end of term. But Nigeria is situated, you have what, the Islamic State of West Africa, you have Boko Haram also operating into the country. And in Nigeria, Buhari is the last president that we are going to have for now for us, a Muslim. Any other candidate that will be presented should be like somebody, the PDP is going to present a candidate that is a Christian, and the APC is also going to present a candidate that is a Christian. But they normally fight, we have religious war into Nigeria. So should a Christian win the election, expect war is going to still continue, because Nigeria is only on the gunpowder going into war. Because now a Muslim is ruling the country, we are still having Boko Haram and Islamic State affairs going into the country. So should a Christian come now to lead the country, I think they are just going to totally disagree with the government, and expect the northern state where they have Muslim-dominated people to go at war, and they are even trying to stage the Biafra independence. All of this, these are some of the key elections that we need to watch into Africa.
We're going to take a short break and be right back.
At Focus on Liberia, we discuss everything Liberia, from education to politics, arts and culture, entertainment, agriculture, history, religion, family, and technology. Focus on Liberia uncovers and showcases the best of Liberia and shows the world the truth about Liberia. We educate, elevate, and promote all things Liberia. We conduct interviews interviews, panel discussions, debates, and more. Tune in to Focus on Liberia on Facebook and YouTube and be a part of the stories that make up the news.
This is Focus on Liberia, and I am Dennis Jah.
Mr. Sharif, with all these elections, are these signs of fledgling democracy, or it's just a charade?
We talked about fledgling democracy, I believe, in the early 2000s, maybe also in the mid 90s. I believe I heard the term in the early 2000s. I heard fledgling democracy. Question is, why is it always fledgling? We should be on solid ground in most of these countries to further the gains of democracy. But that's not the case, because let me take an example. This is, in Guinea, Alpha Condé, and Dennis, your experience living in Guinea as well. Alpha Condé was this opposition leader who fought, the military administration of Lansana Conté. And he can, when Lansana Conté decided to run for president, Alpha Condé was one of the main opposition candidates. And throughout that process, Alpha Condé underwent a lot of repression. His partisans were repressed under the administration of Lansana Conté. And so what ended up happening after Conté's death was the election that occurred. Of course, there was a short-lived military administration, that is Kamara. After he left, there was an election, and Alpha Condé emerged as the winner of that election because he was able to put together a coalition, not just a coalition of the Mandingo people, but a coalition of the Fulanese, a coalition with the Susus, major ethnic groups. So he was able to put together this broad-based coalition that brought him into office. Guinea then was a fledgling democracy, I will argue. And so what happened? Mr. Condé gets elected, and he goes, after the first 5 years, he ran again and won again, right? So his second term should have been over in 2020. But what he does is he manipulates the Constitution and run for a third term. And the Constitution is changed. I believe Edward Amara talked about the constitutional manipulation that occurred in some of these countries. I don't know if it was Dr. Dukla who mentioned that. The constitutional manipulation. One of the things that Alpha Condé did was he manipulated the Constitution, changed the Constitution, not only changed the presidential term of office that was moved from 5 years to 6 years, like stuff that didn't even make any sense. And he's 85 years old. So he moved the presidential term from 5 years to 6 years and allowed himself to run again for a third term. That was a constitutional coup. And the fact that ECOWAS did nothing about that is very troubling, because what you have now, you've given other leaders a template upon which to stay in office. And then, of course, you always have the military that's going to come in as the savior of the people, right? At least that's how they're going to present it. Because when the people, the common people, protest, what do these administrations do? They're very brutal, as you see in the case of Sudan, just recently, and I'll talk about that shortly. But in the case of Guinea, the opposition protesters were it was very heavy-handed repression that went on. Opposition protesters were, some were killed, others were thrown in jail. Opposition offices were shut down. So we shouldn't have been, and still we're now talking about, a fledgling democracy. We shouldn't have been talking about a fledgling democracy when it comes to Guinea. We should be talking about a flourishing democracy instead of a fledgling democracy, where you have these leaders who are not patriotic, who are greedy, who are selfish. Like in the case of Alpha Condé, who tried to stay in office, to die in office, sort of president for life. We've seen that with people like Kamuzu Banda. The only thing he didn't say he was president for life, but clearly his designs were meant for him to stay in office for life. And that's why instead of talking about flourishing democracy, we talk about fledgling democracy because of the greed and the disloyal disposition of these politicians.
Thank you. And I even don't like that word. I've argued with people who call Liberia's democracy young democracy. I say, hey, we've had democracy ever since 1847. So you can say that. Let's go to a few of our comments here. I know it will bring about other discussions here. And ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, this is Focus on Liberia. We are discussing key upcoming elections in Africa to watch for. Guess what? We've not even come to Liberia yet, but we are discussing, and then we're going to read some comments here, and I want my guests and panelists here to respond. The first one is coming from Joseph Conto saying, hello. Samuel Sakama does not want us to forget Kenya. Yes, we did not. Adme Salif say, what is really democracy for Africa, in Africa and by Africans? What does this concept mean for us really? He continues, is Western liberal constitutional democracy what works for an emerging continent like Africa? Again, it goes back to the fledgling democracy and emerging continent. Dr. Duke, what's your take on those two questions?
My take is that we still live in a colonial state. You know, the colonial state mindset, when we talk about democracy, people talk about democracy as if you can have political power and nothing else. When you have political power, everything follows. But if you don't have control of all the levels of your country, your state, you're not running a state. Africa is probably today more dependent than it was in 1960. In terms of economic development, in terms of military dependency, security dependency, in terms of... So how you talk about democracy? Democracy is like a word. Okay, we're going to have a festival. We elect somebody who will preside over this thing for 3-4 years, and then we move on to another one. So to have an African democracy, you have to go from the base. It has to come from the bottom of the people. I mean, not because they're the bottom, but the real people who know, who own the country and say, this is our democracy, to free themselves from the new colonialist mentality. And that's what, when you talk about Guinea, Burkina Faso, Mali, all these people have one thing in common. They all were French colonies. Every 2 weeks, they go to Paris for some conference or some meeting or something happening in Paris every day that these people go to. We don't know why. They go to get a haircut in Paris. So, and then when they make an amendment on the constitution, they call it a new constitution, and that allows them to run. And as long as France says it's okay, you're okay. Yeah. Macron says to Condé, no, don't do it. We're already dealing with Alassane issue. Don't do it. He said, no, leave me alone. Because France didn't support him. Because if France had supported him, maybe we should be there. You know, his campaign was financed by Bolloré, a big French company that went and spent $2 million on a concert for the youth and all of that 2 days before the elections. So when we talk about democracy, it's not about these 10% of people running around and saying, we're going to free you, we're going to build you a road, we're going to give you houses. It's about what the 90% of people know about the states. Okay. They don't. And as long as you don't have that, you don't have a real democracy. You have a minority democracy, a petit bourgeois, and then they make compromises with each other, and then they accept some, and then, reject some. So that's why I think we're far from democracy, really. Which means the power of the people.
Emmanuel Jackson, the porous borders in the Sahel region of North Central Africa is responsible for political instabilities in Chad, Mali, and heading directly to the entire West African region. Admekes Salif again, can you all excellent experts please comment on the fact that most of these so-called elections are happening from a neo-colonialistic client-state context where Western countries push their stooges on Africans and manipulate what happens in all these countries to the benefit of the principal Western powers' interest. If we still going to be stooges, anyway.
Okay, let me take the first part of that question, because I think Mohammed talked about that at the beginning when we talked about the transition to where we are now. But we have to look at Africa governance in 3 stages. The first stages, we had the founding fathers. They had all the great ideas, from Sékou Touré to Kwame Nkrumah to Modibo Keïta to Kenneth Kanda, all of that. But they didn't have the means to implement their ideals. They also took themselves as messiahs, that they were saving their countries. They owned the country, and they were overthrown. Those were the ideologues. Those were the people who had ideology. Houphouët-Boigny was capitalist. He was not ashamed about it. And Sékou Touré was socialist. He was not ashamed. But those were ideas, ideology. People thought about it. Say, how do you make this thing work? So the founding fathers were kicked out by the end of the 70s. Then came the generals, from Mobutu to Idi Amin to Doe. You can name them. Moussa Traoré, they were all dictators. The only thing they had in common, they came to save the country from the dictators of our founding fathers. And then in the 1990s, democracy started to pop up. We talk about rule of law, because the West, nobody needed client state anymore. Russia, the Soviet Union fell down, completely broken. Therefore, there was no need for competition for client states. And then they say, okay, let's go to democracy. And again, it started with the French colonies, former colonies. And what did they do? What would they do? They get rid of the founding fathers. Now they can't support the generals anymore because they're too costly and useless. So they say, okay, we're going to go to democracy. And that's how the new colonial states, the new client state, West Africa came in. How would they pass those countries to new leaders? Not the military, no, they're useless. Not the founding fathers with ideologies, no. They'll give it to people who have been in the international community. People who work in the IMF, World Bank, UNDP, UN this and that. And they became, because they're the trusted people, they can give a state to them. And the interest will be safeguarded. That's why we have this system. We have people who are running countries with no ideology, no concept of anything except quote unquote development, meaning I'll build one highway and a hotel where nobody can stay. And then you call it democracy because they have no ideas. They are shopkeepers. They are like, how you say, trusted confidant of New York, Washington, Paris, whatever you call them, London. But they're not, and they were groomed in the West. Most of them, 99% of our actual presidents, unlike the generals, were groomed in the West. And they come back without baggage, and the West trusts them. And that's why the colonial states still persist, and neo-colonial states still persist, because Africans still have not gotten hold of the real power of the country, which is the economy.
Yeah, thank you. Let me read a few last comments. And if you want to place a call and join the discussion, we are at the tail end here. The number is on the screen. Please call that number and participate. Few more comments here. Sam Odu. The problem with African countries is that they tend to adopt democracy by paper, but not in practice, I think. That is why once these people get into power, they become dictators. Africans are still practicing African system of government, like the king, the chiefs, and the subjects. The citizens as people who worship their leaders without participation of running the country. There's a long one here from Darling Warwood. One government after another has refused to change the colonial and corrupt system because they too are benefiting from the corrupt system. After President Doe bloodbath in the name of corruption, he himself became more corrupt than those he murdered. He too started to benefit from the corrupt system crafted by the American Liberians. Taylor, Bryan, and Ellen refused to demolish this colonial corrupt system because they too heavily benefited from the system. George Weah has upgraded. Roto Wing, African democracy is just considered lined up for elections. The plight of the people is totally ignored. And the last one here from our friend Sam Wallo, when voters and the media take the time to investigate and understand where candidates get their campaign funds, then they will help voters understand whose interests are being advanced by the elected officials. But no one asks this question during elections. And Sam, for instance, if people start, and I'm going to speak partly for the media, these candidates do not come to the media because plus or minus the media, they win elections. If someone goes to election without having a debate and you still vote for them, without telling you their plan, and you still line up behind them, without telling you how they're going to make the difference and fix the system, and you still line up behind them. And if you are media and you want to call a spade, they trash you and they don't even want to talk to you, and you still line up behind them. But let me start with you, Amara, on this question of what to say that our democracy is just lining up for elections, because most of the time after these elections, what happened? Do we even care? You are there in the motherland. Is that a true statement?
Absolutely. I think in Africa, the election that is normally organized here is just like to individually satisfy the politicians, because we all understand that when you conduct an election and a candidate wins, they sign a social contract with the electorate. Unfortunately, the oath they normally take in office are definitely not reflected into what they do. We normally see them, they come, they promise. In fact, when you watch at Africa Manifesto, it's all a pre-written thing. Because if you watch at Sierra Leone, watch at Liberia, watch at Guinea, the problems are almost always the same. And they normally manipulate this system. So the voters are normally ignored. Maybe to me, if you ask me, I don't think whether democracy belongs to Africa. Because when you watch at, because you talk about democracy, democracy cannot go without good governance. Unfortunately, Africa preaches democracy, but they do not touch what they call good governance. And when you talk about good governance, you talk about a responsive government, a government that is transparent, a government that is proactive. You talk about a government that is accountable and a government that provides for its citizens. Unfortunately, these things are not reflected into Sierra Leone, neither Liberia nor Guinea. You take a common example, like to comment on the case of Liberia. George Weah came in as a kind of blemish-free person, whom everybody thought they have that mojo by then to take over the governance in Liberia. Everybody trusted him. When you watch at what is happening today in Liberia, you may think that it's just like a matter of rewarding himself and rewarding of those who are actually surrounded by him. You watch at the Gambia, Adama Barrow was watched as a savior. When he came in, he has lost his popularity. Now he has not even formed a coalition with the man that deteriorated the Gambian situation over 22 years. And now people want to look for another person. So the problem is almost all the same. Most of these elections are only organized in the name of those contesting the election. Maybe we can watch a good governance system, because just after independence, we saw Africa develop what they call the one-party state system, and our political fathers advanced certain reason. And when you watch at the one-party state was somehow bit connected to the African democracy, their own culture, because they believe that in unity. But although one party came with a lot of other things, but at least there was unity. And since there was no other political party being formed, so that division of view, trying to form political parties that may create problems, we are actually eliminated. But it also make them to be dictators. They manipulated the system. They become nepotists, and there were a lot of other things happen. Maybe I think Africa should reorganize themselves. All of these elections that have been organized, the electorate at the end of the day ignore, and we are not voting on quality. We are voting on popularity, and at the same time our tribal mentality, section where you are coming from, all of these things. And it is only in Africa where you see politicians or voters worship political parties. Irrespective, like in Sierra Leone here, they have what they call the SLPP and the APC. So those who are coming from the east, even if the SLPP gives somebody who is not a qualified politician, who the voters clearly know that person is not ought to represent them, but as long as he's a representative of the SLPP party, definitely they will vote for him. If you go into the north, as long as that person is an APC representative, irrespective of the political caliber of that person, even though the voters may have access and they understood that the person whom he is contesting with, but that person is coming from the opposition party, but is more competent and can adequately represent them, they will definitely vote him not, but rather they will go and vote in for the person who is coming from that party. So that is it. So most of the time, I think the problem emanates from voters themselves because of our tribal and ignorant mentality, and also comes from the electorate, from the politicians. They are deceivers, so they are just scrupulous, selfish pleasure seekers who have carefully manipulated the system for their own benefits.
Thank you. Let's end with this, because a lot of theories have been advanced as to how we move forward. I remember maybe 20 years ago, I wrote something about customizing our democracy, make it to fit us, so that we are not struggling with something that we can really adapt to. Take for instance, if I run against Mr. Sharif in an election, we enemies for forever, because hey, brothers don't have to go in the public and fight, right? Because that's how we're brought up. So do we do something on our own to fit our culture and the way we've been socialized? Another thing is the economy, right? All these things run on the economy. So if you don't have money, and look at the elections that are taking place in Liberia. I mean, keep the people so poor, so that at the time of election, when you give them a bag of gari, you got them. So with the economy, how do we kind of do this whole election and democracy business that it will really fit our needs? Or do we need, as Samuel Tua said, a benevolent dictator? Or we need people say, oh, why can't we take someone like the J.J. Rollenstein? All these things are being floated. Oh, I think there was a comment here about Kagame, Paul Kagame, dictator, but everybody's saying, hey, look at Rwanda, look at Rwanda. So let's go around the room and see how do we make this thing work for us. Mr. Sherry, let me start with you.
Yeah, so one of the things I believe Ms. Sharif is asking is what is, all of this is Western imposition. But keep in mind, Africans have tried all of it. They've tried the one-party state. They've tried the chieftaincy. I remember in one documentary I watched about a year or two ago, Mobutu had just hung 3 of his ministers for attempted coup or whatever. One of the ministers, Everest Kimba, and he was asked the question, and he said these guys were critical. And one of the things he said, they were critical of the regime, and they criticized me. And in Africa, we don't criticize the chief. And he was talking to Western reporters, and he said to them, he said, the concept of the chief in Africa is not the same as yours. Our democracy, Mobutu said, is not the same as your democracy. So they still, ask him the question. And he said, again, I repeat, our democracy is not the same as your democracy. In Africa, we have the chief, and the chief is the chief, and the chief cannot be criticized. So, Mobutu, so using that sort of chieftaincy mentality, he was able to brutalize his own people, stole his country wealth and resources all over the place. You had Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, right? A promising new nation that went into bankruptcy. We've tried all of this. And then Africans have also tried military dictatorship. And now Africans are sort of going back to, and keep in mind, as Dr. Duclos mentioned earlier, for the most part, we're talking about sub-Saharan Africa. And Africans are now moving towards democracy again. We were there before. The move is now towards democracy. To me, Dennis, we are still trying to find our own identity. What is good for us? What is good? And when I say us, I mean the African politicians, the bourgeois that Dr. Duclos talked about. I believe they're still finding their identity. What is really good for us? So that has not been answered, and I think that's a very important question. And by the way, before we came on tonight, I was listening to Radio France, RFI. The military ruler Abdel Fattah al-Burhan just released the Prime Minister Abdullah Hamdok from prison. He was under house arrest. He has just been released to reclaim his position as the prime minister. So in other words, the coup has failed. And now, Dennis, over 40 Sudanese have been killed by this military dictator. So now tell me, you know, what is up with this? Right. So these protesters, these activists that were now killed are just sacrificed. And perhaps this dictator is never going to be held responsible for anything. So as we look at the West for all of our problems, for all of the things, we also need to evaluate ourselves. What are we doing to ourselves? Colonialism was bad. So the imperialists never really left us. When it was a slave trade, after the slave trade, what did they do? They partitioned Africa among themselves. So after colonialism, you have neocolonialism. You have you still have the Western influence. You had these leaders that were imposed on the African people by Western imperialists. That being said, what are we to do ourselves? You have, so quickly, and I'm going to finish on this point. You have the classic example of Liberia. George Weah was elected by the Liberian people to solve a problem. He never made any kind of concrete promises because there was no debate. This is a man who never came to debate. He never conveyed any message to the Liberian people beyond these sound bites, beyond these battle cries from his, supporters. And yet he was elected. And I think that's what you were communicating just now. He was elected. And so what do you have now? You have an administration that's not responsive to the Liberian people. What Western country is telling George Weah not to build schools for his own people? What Western country is telling him, not to build hospitals for his own people? What Western country is telling him that? What Western country is imposing on him to go out there and get Liberia into more debt? So as we look at others, when you look at the mirror, sometimes you should also look at yourself and see what you're doing to yourself. So I think if the African leaders look at themselves, the solution for their own problem may be in their own hands. So Abiy Ahmed, that Edward Amara mentioned earlier, Abiy Ahmed had a perfect opportunity to resolve the issue in Ethiopia. But what he did, he isolated the Tigrayans and invaded Tigray. And he proclaimed that, these rebels were defeated, or whatever he called them, that they were defeated. He drove them into the mountains and imposed martial law in Tigray. And what ended up happening, it has backfired to the extent that now the capital, Addis Ababa, is, according to reports that we've heard now, is that the capital may be overrun by the Tigrayan rebels. And so how can we not resolve our own issues? Dennis, and I'll conclude with this. Even in our own community, in our own communities, you have EULA, and then you have people in EULA, and then you have other groups who will form EULA 1, EULA 2, right? Even in our own community organizations, we never get along. And so this is something that we do really, really need to look at and evaluate on the local level, on the national level, and see how best we can, ensure that Africa is a country that is not always in the headlines. We're not always going out there, looking for handouts. In fact, that we are a country self-sufficient and able to govern our own country. Our own country, I should say.
Dr. Duke, same question. How do we move forward? What do we do now? Are we at the end of the road?
We're not at the end of the road. First, we have to say, okay, Africa has been independent probably 56 years, so we're still young compared to Western democracies. But that is not an excuse. We have a budging, great middle class. Somehow, somewhere, 10% of the people know how to read and write. But how do you break down the colonial states? That's the whole question. How do you break down? Because somebody came to your house and imposed a system of dominance that took your resources, took your money, took your pride, took everything from you. And then when you chase that person, you keep the same system in place. So you're not free. That's the whole problem. As long as we have not broken down the colonial state system, we keep doing the same things and we have the same result. You always have 1 or 2% of the people at a time, at any given time, who are running the country, using it for their benefit, and then they'll be replaced for another 1 to 3%. And the 99% of the people will just be sitting there waiting, because we have not sold or we have not taken property of ownership of this nation state. We just after the political power that make you rich and run away with things. But we have not broken down the colonial state, and that led us into the new colonial state, and then we're doing the same thing. You know,
yeah, Dr. Drew, are we blaming other people for our issues? Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I don't blame other people. I think I blame, we should blame ourselves.
Okay.
Whatever he talks about, we are not doing anything, he's doing this and that. But why is we capable of doing it? Because there's a small middle class of Liberia who is content as long as they're not touched directly by things. They don't care. They'll either say, okay, I'm out of this, I'm not part of this, I'm not into partisan politics. But that's a problem, that the middle class, the small middle class that is there, it's so in tune to power and also want to get his own share someday, somehow. And it's also afraid to fight. Because, and then the power get, the government get too strong, because nobody wants to look at the government in the face and say, no, you can't do this. You can't kill everybody. So we're living in a fishbowl, and we're doing the same thing, turn around, because we're dealing with a bad product. The bad product is the colonial state, the mentality of the colonial state. What was done to us, we keep doing it. Who run business in Liberia today? Who run the economy? It's not Liberians. No Liberian run economy in Liberia. No Liberian run. You go to a hotel, you see they say Liberians with a bachelor degree from the University of Liberia being servers, and you got kids from Philippines with a certificate being their bosses. I've seen that. It's everywhere. In every supermarket in Golden Monrovia, every supermarket, every hotel is run the same exact thing. And that's how we run the states. And that's how we're inside.
Thank you. Amara.
I think it's unfortunate that our leaders never study Europe or the Western world when they embrace democracy. If you study history, you understand that liberal democracy never came to Europe automatically. They developed themselves. We have been led by strong leaders who we are dictators. After developing the country, they reach the status of nationhood, have strong economy, strong infrastructural development, and then they decided to embrace liberal democracy. We blew across Europe. And when they came into Africa, I think democracy was imposed on Africa as a careful means for them to destroy the state that Africa used to be. Prior to the coming of democracy into Africa, we used to have a stable African democracy where they lead themselves. And I think, as I said initially, one-party system was a bit synonymous to the type of leadership that was found into Africa. Maybe it was not the right time for them to embrace democracy and just impose it on the entire. Because just after independence, we have a lot of military coup, and most of those guys who took over, you watch at the north before 2011 Arab uprising, the Arab uprising. The Middle East was the beast. I mean, the Northern part of Africa was stable. They were economically viable. But when they introduced liberal democracy into North Africa, now we are seeing that the situation is being deteriorated. Even watch into certain places into Africa, though you may have corrupt leaders who have imposed themselves, they have managed to enrich themselves overnight, and also created a family dynasty to continue leading, like of Equatorial Guinea, where you have a Nguema family. Even watch at the Oman Bongo of Gabon. Even watch, take a common example. You don't think that if liberal democracy is to be enforced on Kigali, would Paul Kagame have able to do what he has done today? No. Now he's even going to be into power until 2036. But we are not actually preaching for that. However, if ever democracy is to be embraced into Africa, then it should be like a gradual process instead of just imposing, because people are not even adequately educated on democracy and what we need to understand about democracy. That is why most of these leaders who are even elected into power, they tend to abuse the system because they take they manipulate the people's mentality and use what they have to give. Most of the time, they even bribe the system. They impoverish the voters.
Mr. Amara, sorry to interrupt you. I use saying, in a case, first things first. Like you talk about education, you use the European example that first they were dictators. They used that time to build themselves before welcoming democracy. So in your, or are you saying right now we are not at a point of even being educated to understand what are the dictates and demands of democracy? Are you saying we should first go through some form of dictatorship or colonial era or something, or get educated? What do you think should be done first before we get to democracy? Just some clarity.
I think our African leaders would have understood first that democracy is not a culture of Africa. And if democracy is to be introduced into Africa, they should first study the culture of the people and know which part of democracy to take and which part not to take, so that the democracy that they are preaching to can be in harmony with the African culture. But democracy was something very foreign. And even in Europe, not all European countries started with liberal democracy as the way it is, but they managed to inculcate the system gradually and until it was finally disseminated to all wings. So ours came automatic and they imposed it. And that was a kind of carefully orchestrated plan by the colonizers to still continue maintaining control over us. Because wheresoever there is political instability into Africa, our colonial fathers tend to involve into it. And when they involve into it, they exploit us, they continue to create political instability, and they even tend to impose leaders who may definitely not deliver us out of the wood where we are. So what I'm saying here in essence here, the system would have been carefully studied and know which part to bring into Africa and which part not to bring. So not all democracies that are actually welcome into Africa, even into Europe. There are certain European countries that are not even part of the EU because they have failed to welcome democracy. And their country is very stable. So we are seeing this thing. Maybe our African leaders never thought about this. Finally, to conclude, I think we need to have a kind of national agenda, because each and every government that comes, they come with their own platform. It is only in Africa if government A was in power and that particular government knows that the predecessor actually was working on a very good agenda. When they come, they hardly continue. They tend to do away with that predecessor mentality and tend to initiate new things. And you cannot continue. If developing a government is continuation, not doing away with policies. And policies don't like agenda. If you know that particular government policy was actually good, it is that time you work on it. I think if we can have a kind of national agenda, where most of the country's plans are not only being lost, are not only maintained into the constitution, but we should have a kind of national policy. Any government that comes into power should know that this is our target and this is what should be done. Or else all about Africa may be a deteriorating situation, because each government comes with their own new plan and they fail to follow it. And above all, we should have a kind of strong media into Africa. That is one, and the civil society should be a kind of active within Africa. But unfortunately, our education system is so poor because illiteracy is high. The three enemies of mankind in Africa are illiteracy, poverty, and ignorance. But at least, even though we are poor, but if we are illiterate, we may manage to fight against the ignorance and even defeat the poverty. But the education and win has definitely been abandoned. That is why voters do not even know what they go to the polls to vote for. They only go to vote in the name of political parties, in the name of tribal line, in the name of family. They do not even want to judge anything because they are not adequately educated, and most of the decisions that they take are definitely not sound, and their decisions tend to haunt them at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Addie Tyler from Pennsylvania, and you're watching Focus on Liberia.
Your microphone is not on.
We are discussing key upcoming elections in Africa, and we'll be concluding now, but let me give you a window into what we're going to be discussing next week. Tomorrow, Monday, we're going to have the Liberian Association of Canada, LAC, the elections 2021. Mr. Leo Johnson, who's the current president, is going to be seeking his second term. And they'll be here to present their platform and interact with the Liberian community. This we have Mr. Emmanuel Savage, will be co-hosting with Mr. Ansoni Sie. So this will be a collaboration between Focus on Liberia and the Emmanuel Savage show. You don't want to miss it. Then on Wednesday, guess what? I attended the ANC Global Convention in Charlotte, North Carolina. So I'm going to be giving my report. We're going to be doing a report. So I'm going to be appearing on the Hour of Politics, hosted by the political bulldog, Mr. Ansoni Sie. And I'm going to be giving my report, my critique and analysis of the ANC convention. You don't want to miss it. Come with all your questions and everything you want to know. I will be the guest for the first time on the Hour of Politics. Again, gentlemen, thank you so much for tonight. I'll go around the room for 30 seconds each for you to give me your parting comment. Let me start with Dr. Duke.
Well, I think I'll come back to the first thing that I say. Elections don't mean democracy, and elections don't always produce the results we want. And we will not get democracy until we really understand the nature of nation states, and that people that we drag to the polls every 5 years, 6 years, really know what it means to have a state. What does it stand for? What does it, what are you supposed to expect from that state? What are the things that we need to do? So I think the problem is education and money. The economy is still run as the colonial economy that we inherited. We never changed it. We didn't educate our people about what is democracy. So we're going to go be in circle. Of course, we have these feel-good things going on every 5, 6 years, but the essence of what we want, to empower our people, to give them a say in their own country, to give them a say on the economy, would not happen overnight. This could go on for a long, long time.
Thank you, Mr. Amara. Your parting comments.
Yeah, thank you. I think our government need to actually invest much into education, and especially the young population to Africa, because the situation that Africa has been placed may definitely end up deteriorating in the next 5 or 10 years if careful education is not being taught into school, and maybe patriotism can be practiced by giving the children the right education that they should achieve, and maybe we may learn to take wise decisions at the polls, and incidents like what is happening to Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and other places may definitely be stopped. Because if Zimbabweans were not educated, trust me, that country would have not only been led by a dictator, but by now they would have been fighting war. But maybe Zimbabwe has one of the best educated, one of the best education into Africa, and most of their citizens are educated. That was why they never took arms and ammunition to fight against Robert Mugabe. They did whatsoever thing they could, and Mugabe is gone to the door, he's dead. So I think education is the way forward for Africa.
Thank you so much. Mr. Sharif, your closing comments.
Oh, thank you, Dennis. So one of the things that that's troubling our African continent is greed and the thirst for wealth and power. And so as long as you have that, you're always going to have a situation where African leaders try to overstay. And because they try to overstay, you have instability, like we have in Guinea and some other countries. Why not African leaders learn from the experiences of countries that have successfully implemented democracy? I'm talking about Botswana, Cape Verde, stuff like that. So, as long as that is not happening, you're still going to have us, in this sort of fledgling stage. At what point we are going to move from the fledgling stage to the flourishing stage? And so I long for a day that Africa will become a flourishing democracy. Now, going back to something Amara said, and again, I counter, these things have been tried. We have one-man rule. You have one-party state. You have the embodiment of the state. Mobutu Sese Seko, those guys were the embodiment of the state. They were the state. That didn't work. It failed. It led to civil war, destruction of lives and whatnot. we've gone into the military. We've gone into stage with the military. Now we're in a new stage. We've been here before, and so it's not working. One of the reasons why it's not working is because of greed, and people are not patriotic. And I think that the school curriculum, our curriculum, needs to incorporate something about honesty and democracy, the rule of law, the administration of justice, and how kids should be taught to work hard for your money, work hard for whatever you want to do. And lastly, there has to be a strong private sector. Deprioritize the public sector. And when you do all of those things, hopefully we can find a way out of our current mess.
Thank you so much. On that note, I want to say thank you, gentlemen, for availing yourself to discuss this all important topic. I think we should look at these elections one more time and take them one at a time and do a little deep dive into them when the time comes. But again, I want to thank you so much. I want to thank all our viewers across the globe who watched and who are going to watch later. Keep it here at Focus on Liberia, where we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. Until then, we end with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Good night, and God bless you.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home.